The contribution we had from Professor Giraud, it's another important step forward in our understanding of the strategies to be put in action in order to cope with the issue of social inclusion. For reasons of time, I have selected only 3 specific points as a commentator is supposed to do in these cases. Giraud properly defines the relational capability index, drawing on Amartya Sen's notion of capability, approach, etc. And he rightly stresses that this index is rooted in a relational anthropology, which means not in the Homo economicus anthropology. Perhaps it would be proper to remind that there is another an anthropological assumption which goes back to the 18th century, which says, Homo homini natura amicus. Every man is by nature a friend to another man. Homo homini lupus goes to Hobbes, but Hobbes, as we know, drew it from Plato. He did not invent that. It was Plato many centuries before. And so it is proper, perhaps, if we want to redress the content of economic theorizing, to start from the proper anthropological assumption, because it is obvious that if we maintain in our economic theorizing the Homo economicus lupus assumption, there is only one strategy: to defend oneself against a wolf, because wolves are dangerous, etc. And in this regard, my question to Giraud is why in this index, relational capability index, the authors of the paper, which I've read carefully, do not speak of relational goods. You prefer to speak of club goods and public goods, but public goods and club goods are qualitatively different from relational goods. So perhaps a word of clarification may be in order, because the very moment that you talk of relational anthropology, and when you go to the specification, you speak of club or public goods, you go back in the other anthropological perspective. The other question is the issue of comparison, interpersonal comparison of relational capabilities. This is a huge problem in epistemology, as we know. Perhaps I would like to draw your attention, Gael, to that position which is called positional objectivity. Between subjectivity and objectivity, there is an intermediate position which was for the first time developed by a French philosopher and scientist in the 30s of last century, Émile Borel, Space and Time. That is a fascinating book that nobody quotes, because important books should not be quoted. And in that book, Borel says, we scientists, he was both a philosopher and a scientist, we are between these 2 poles, objectivity and subjectivity. But that is not true, because there is an intermediate position which he called positional objectivity that Amartya Sen further developed in a paper whose title was Positional Objectivity in Economics. Now, I have no time to illustrate, but I think the point can be taken. Now, coming to the other, that was my first point. The second point, you correctly raised a fundamental issue, mobilizing climate finance. In other words, how to finance the ecological transition. This is a really strategically important point. In this same room, Mark Carney, a few years ago, said that a too rapid movement towards a low-carbon economy is dangerous, and that is a quotation that you too have in your paper. Now, what is from a theoretical point of view, the underpinning? Traverse analysis. As you know, John Hicks, a Nobel Prize winner in economics from Oxford, was the inventor of traverse analysis. But mainstream economics always refuse to follow that. Traverse analysis is type of analysis which answer the following question. If we want to move from an equilibrium to another equilibrium because the new equilibrium is deemed to be superior, there is no need to use Pareto optimality in this case, we have to consider that the transition is not instantaneous. It takes time, and second, there are the so-called transition costs. So we have to evaluate the transition cost and transition benefits of traverse analysis. So what you have done, it's in my opinion very interesting and important, because your proposal of special drawing rights and the creation of green climate fund might go in that direction. Perhaps if you could elaborate also in a time perspective framework, this transition, that would help a lot policymakers, governments, and the international institutions to move, as Jeffrey was saying before, a step forward in that direction. Now, the third point has to do with the ethical issues being involved in the transition towards a low-carbon economy. And that I highly appreciate the fact that you have dedicated a paragraph, or better to say a section of your paper to the ethical dimension, because in general that is never done. And I like it. And in this case, we have, again, a problem for which we economists are mostly responsible. Because when we use the intertemporal discount rate, we refer to the famous and celebrated Ramsey rule. Interest rate equal the rate of growth. But we keep on forgetting that this rule by Ramsey from Cambridge works only within an optimal growth setup, where some kind of authority can fix the so-called transversality conditions. The point is that we allowed people, in particular policymakers, who are not supposed to know these technicalities, to believe that applying that rule would solve the problem. The opposite is true. It's creating disasters. Because that rule applies only, I repeat, if there is somebody who can give us the transversality conditions in order to solve the optimal growth problem. And since this authority at the world level does not exist because nobody believes in the world government, Rocco before corrected himself when he said the world government, then he specified world governance, which is the point that Benedict XVI made clear in the last part of Caritas in Veritate, etc. So here we come to the point. If we cannot adopt that technical apparatus for the reasons that I mentioned, it is obvious that a solution cannot be found within neither the utilitarian ethics nor the so-called neo-contractualistic ethic. Because if you apply roles and neo-contractualism, the representatives of the future generation cannot go behind the veil of ignorance, as we know Rawls said. So we need to decide which kind of ethical apparatus we want to give to our reasoning. My suggestion is that we have to go back to the ethic of virtue. The ethic of virtue, which is the oldest one, started with Aristotle, then St. Thomas, Aquinas added many other considerations, has in particular, in this case, a gist, phronesis. Phronesis is practical wisdom, or prudence in Latin. Now, as Thomas said, prudence has a supplementary virtue, which is called gnome in Greek. And gnome is that particular virtue allowing people to make decisions even if the terms among which to decide are not clear, are not existent. In other words, this is the reason why we poor economists suffer, because we do not have a theory of decision. We have a theory of choice. But to choose is not the same thing as to decide, because I choose among alternatives whom I know already. When I have to decide, I do not know what, and the case that you have raised is typical of this. Perhaps we should insist more on a return to the ethic of virtue, because I notice that even most economists perhaps are in bona fide compelled to go back either to the utilitarian framework or to the neo-contractualistic framework. A last point, and then I have finished. What you raised, Gail, it's an important case of what are called pecuniary externalities. As we know, in economics, there are two types of externalities. Technical, about which we know everything, have been published millions of books and papers on how to cope with technical externality. Just to mention the cause theorem, which is creating a lot of disasters. He passed away a few years ago, so he was certainly bona fide. Why? Because in the case of environment, climate change, it's not technical externalities which are relevant, but mainly pecuniary externalities. And pecuniary externality is one example that ethicists call adiaphoric responsibility. Because moral responsibility is not only direct and indirect, but it's also adiaphoric. In other words, consequences which do not stem directly from my action or indirectly, but on the structures that have been created in this regard. And this is what, in my opinion, occurs. In other words, the fact that the market price, is not only an allocative function, but it plays also a distributive function of incomes and wealth, etc. Just to give an example, the price consumers pay for their cheaper imports does not include.
3 minutes.
Yes, I have only 1 minute, 2 minutes. It does not include the cost of retraining, laid off domestic workers, etc. So to conclude, I wanted just to mention, since you quoted the business as usual scenario, what is perhaps a reason of hope is the recent analysis by UN Global Compact and Accenture, which was published 2 years ago, the title being CEO Study on Sustainability. This is a study of more than 1,000 CEOs from 27 industries across 103 countries. Now, I read the quote, which synthesizes the 1,000 CEOs say, I quote, "The global economy is on the wrong track, and business is not playing its part in forging a sustainable future." I was impressed, because these words were not dictated by Pope Francis, but by 1,000 CEOs in 103. Perhaps there is some reasons to maintain a sense of hope, moderate hope towards the future, but we have to insist more in that direction. Thank you very much.